The UK's economic policy isn't quite hitting the mark right now.
Are you better running the pub than you are at the darts?
Very much so, very much so.
Among top-tier economies, the UK will perform the worst this year, according to the International Monetary Fund. The top reason?
I think energy is the big one for us. Staff costs, food costs, drinks costs, the whole smorgasbord of costs are on the rise. The costs are pretty horrendous and start only getting bigger.
High energy and food bills aren't just a problem across Mark's 11 pubs, but across the entire nation, according to the IMF. Staff shortages and rising mortgage costs and taxes mean the UK will perform worse this year than even Russia. The IMF predicts that Britain's economy will shrink by more than 0.5% this year, making it the only leading nation expected to enter a recession. These aren't just meaningless numbers, there are real-world consequences to our faltering economy. The number of firms going bankrupt in England and Wales jumped 57% in the year just gone, the worst figures since the height of the financial crisis in 2009. Just today, Paperchase went into administration, more than 800 jobs likely to be lost. Tesco has bought the brand, but it's unlikely they'll keep any staff. In fact, Tesco said they would shed more than 1,500 of their own team manager posts today. The downgraded IMF predictions are either proof of economic mismanagement or numbers to be taken with a pinch of salt, depending on which side of these green benches an MP sits.
The world upgraded, Britain downgraded. Growth even worse than sanctions hit Russia.
Well, what we've seen is that the IMF's predicted lots of things and they've turned out not to be true. In fact, over the last couple of years, the UK has grown faster than, say, Germany, Japan and other countries, in which the IMF had predicted was the other way around. In fact, the IMF's chief economist came out today and said that their previous predictions had been wrong. So, you know, these are predictions. What I'm interested in facts and reality.
Some politicians have made the point, look, looking at these numbers, isolated numbers, doesn't do us justice. 2022 was a very good year for the UK economy. This isn't really fair just to look at these numbers. On the whole, the UK is doing all right. They've got a point, haven't they?
In terms of how we look over the last couple of years, yes, the UK grew reasonably strongly in 2022, but that's largely because we had such a tough time over the pandemic in 2020 and the first half of 2021 in particular.
There is one other UK-specific event that plays into today's numbers. Today is the 3rd anniversary of Brexit, the anniversary of an event that made staff shortages inevitable, say business groups. For some Brexit-backing Conservative MPs, what's needed now to boost the economy are tax cuts.
My concern is the British government, whilst I understand what they're doing, they've got to recognise there are certain key areas of business which does need to have a greater level of tax reduction, easing on it, and then individuals, of course, in due course.
So if you had in front of you either a tax cut or just getting inflation down, which one would you pick?
I think inflation down at this time, yeah. From the personal level and an ideological level, I would go for tax cuts. However, from a business perspective at this time, I'm still on the side of cutting costs and support at the moment. This is unprecedented to me in my working career.
The government argues making economic predictions is always a bit of a gamble, nothing's assured. The problem is, the same is true for government policy, and the PM is now fighting a growing chorus for tax cuts from within his own party.
Paul McNamara with that report. Well, I'm now joined by economics reporter Neil MacDonald. Some people say forecast, schmorecast. How seriously should we take this?
Well, Matt, we could have been having a lovely conversation right now about some good economic news for once, because today the IMF was talking about more growth in China, talking about a resilient economy in Europe. Unfortunately, those glimmers of optimism, it did not extend to the UK. As Paul was explaining, it sees the UK as the only major industrial nation actually shrinking in output this year. Now, that is a forecast. It is not a fact yet. But the IMF identifies a number of big economic problems in the UK. It says we're more exposed to high gas prices than others. Fewer of our workers have returned to employment since the COVID lockdown. And of course, the Bank of England is raising interest rates sharply here.
OK, so what else have we learned today about the economy?
OK, so we're talking about forecasts. Now let's talk about some actual data. And it does shed some light on how those rises in interest rates are starting to affect the housing market. So if you look at the number of mortgages being approved to buy a house. You can see how it falls over the autumn. Today we learned in December, just 35,000 or so new mortgages approved. Now that is, apart from the COVID period, that's the lowest monthly number since 2009, when, of course, the UK economy was in recession. And the reason, of course, rising interest rates.
And just remind us why that matters.
Well, a lot of economists think that as those numbers go down, house prices are going to go down with them. That might sound like good news if you're hoping to buy a property, though, of course, your mortgage rate's probably also gone up as well. But the truth is that a buoyant housing market does tend to support the rest of the economy, not just the building of new homes, but, of course, the moving and the refurbishing of homes. And all of that activity is likely to slip away.
So, sum it up, where does that leave the economy?
Well, of course, we all like to think about how we're doing versus other countries. The truth is that that does shift around. What has not really shifted around now is this dramatic downshift in our economic performance over the last decade. And it's illustrated here by this chart from the Resolution Foundation. This shows economic output per person in the UK rising over decades, and they very helpfully projected it all the way up to today. Unfortunately, of course, that continuation, that top line, isn't what happened. What actually happened is the bottom white line.
Yeah,
if we'd stayed on the top line, we'd have been £10,000 per person better off. We'd have been a much wealthier nation. That would have helped not just with, for example, better public services or indeed tax cuts, but closing the gap between those two lines remains the great unsolved problem for the British economy.
Neil, thank you very much indeed. Well, the Shadow Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rachel Reeves, joins us now from Central Lobby in the House of Commons. Rachel Reeves, thank you very much for coming on the programme. You heard those numbers there. Neil gave us a wonderful summary. They're pretty dismal, aren't they? But we spoke to Jacob Rees-Mogg, and we'll run that interview after we've spoken to you. And he said, you know, the IMF gets this stuff wrong all the time. And by the way, Brexit has been a marvellous success. Your response?
I find it so frustrating when there's so many opportunities here in Britain for the economy to grow and thrive and create good jobs paying decent wages in all parts of the country. And yet we're not seizing those opportunities. And in fact, the forecasts today show that we're likely to fall further behind our neighbours and our competitors around the world. And those missed opportunities means missed incomes, means less money for our public services. And what we saw today from the IMF was the world upgraded and Britain downgraded. We've got to get out of this vicious spiral of low pay, low productivity and low economic growth. And that's what I would be determined to do as Chancellor of the Exchequer.
But the question is how you get out of that spiral if you get elected. Because the Tory party, after 13 years in power, would have been a lot more then, has made the bed that you have to lie in. And there are certain constrictions there that you can't get around, are there?
I totally accept the argument that the inheritance of an incoming Labour government is going to be a tough one because this government has crushed the economy, public services are on their knees and people are facing a cost of living crisis. But Labour's plans, our Green Prosperity Plan to take advantage of new industries and new jobs like carbon capture and storage, green hydrogen, tidal energy, are exactly the sorts of areas where Britain could excel. Same with life sciences, our cultural industries. There are big opportunities there for a government that's willing to partner with business to realise that potential in all parts of the country.
That sounds great, but you do have to pay for it. Now, the green agenda, I think you've said, will cost you £27 billion. That's what you have to borrow to make it work. Ed Balls, who used to be, what you are now, Shadow Chancellor, just the other day said, that is a massive problem because you cannot borrow that much money under the current economic circumstances, or indeed the circumstances that you are likely to inherit.
Well, let's look at what's happening around the world. In the United States, President Biden is implementing the Inflation Reduction Act, which is investment in these industries of the future. In Europe, the Net Zero Industry Act is about ensuring that Europe gets its share of investment in those industries of the future. Now, Britain can either sit it out and say, oh, let the US and Europe develop those technologies and jobs of the future, or we can get stuck in and seize those opportunities for towns and cities across the UK UK. I'm determined we don't miss out on those opportunities. And so investing in things to boost our productivity, boost our growth, and to actually get our economy firing on all cylinders, those are good investments, wise investments that government will make alongside business, because business investment is absolutely essential too in realising those opportunities.
But I know the European Union is obsessed with getting a better deal out of the, America's, Green Inflation Reduction Act. But we're not part of that gang anymore. We're going to do this by ourselves. And again, on the question of borrowing, are you okay to borrow that much more money when the economy has basically run out of it and we're already on our knees?
Well, look, the Conservatives tried last year to borrow to fund tax cuts. That was unsustainable and markets reacted to it. But there's a difference between that short-term sugar rush and investing in those things alongside business, a partner to business, in things that will improve our productivity and our growth. That's what the US are doing. That's what European countries are doing. And we're sitting on the sidelines. And I fear that unless we get in on this game, that in the years to come, we're going to find we are importing electric vehicles, importing steel, importing electricity, because we missed this moment to invest here in Britain to get those good jobs, that investment right here to our shores.
Let's get back to that bed that I described at the beginning. Part of that bed is also that the Tory party has raised taxes to a level that we haven't seen since the 1950s. And, of course, we're out of the EU. And you won't talk about return to the single market or the customs union. So basically, you have snookered yourself, partly because of what you're committed not to do, and partly because of the situation they're going to leave for you if you get to power.
Well, let me face into both of those questions. First of all, on tax, you're right that we have the highest tax burden in Britain since the Second World War.
And you
those
can't
higher
raise
taxes,
them anymore.
Well, and those higher taxes are all gone on working people. Now, we've just had a vote in the House of Commons this evening to get the government to look at getting rid of the non-dom tax loophole, because I say, if you make Britain your home, you should pay your taxes here. And under Labour, you will. And
that's not going to make you the money you need. That's £4 billion pounds if you're lucky.
Well, and that money we will use to have one of the biggest ever expansions of the NHS workforce, nearly doubling the number of places at medical school, increasing the number of midwives and district nurses. Those are the priorities of an incoming Labour government compared to the Tories, who just want to keep these tax loopholes that benefit some of the very richest people in society. But let me also answer your question, though, about Brexit. Look, Labour have said that we're not going to reopen that divisive debate that created so many divisions in our communities and in our families, but we will fix some of the gaping holes in the Brexit deal that the government secured, because it is holding back British businesses and exporters. And whether that is in professional services, our cultural industries, in our farming industry, or in chemicals, there is much more that government could do to get a deal that actually works for the British economy.
But that's really tricky, isn't it? Because that might involve sector-by-sector negotiations, which would be long-winded and very fractious. Finally, and very briefly, if I may.
Say, there's a review anyway into the Trade and Cooperation Act in 2025, and we would use that opportunity to close some of those holes to get a better deal for British consumers and British businesses.
OK, we've got to leave it there. Rachel Reeves, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Well, earlier I spoke to Jacob Rees-Mogg, who was, of course, Business Secretary last year under Liz Truss when she was Prime Minister, and I asked him what he thinks of the IMF's predictions for the UK.
There are two things to say. First of all, it's worth looking, and I've got a sheet here with the figures on, how the UK has done on the IMF figures over the last 2 years, so 21 and 22, when we've outperformed advanced economies. We've outperformed the United States, Germany, France, Italy, Spain, Japan, and Canada. So we're coming off 2 relatively strong years with cumulative growth of 11.9%, higher than all those other countries. So you would expect that if you've had 2 very strong years, I mean, this is practically biblical, you then move to a less good period. The other thing, which I've also got immediately to hand, thanks to the estimable Guido Fawkes, is that the IMF has under-forecast the UK's GDP every year since 2016. And in some years, quite significantly. In 2021, it was hopelessly wrong. And in 2022, again, it was wrong by a significant margin. But every year since 2016 makes you think that the IMF's forecasts aren't actually worth the paper they're written on.
But the thing is, the ordinary people living in this country trying to survive in this economic environment, you know, they don't really care that much about the IMF numbers. But what they do care about is the reality of their lives. Higher taxes, lower living standards, public services in a pretty dismal state, and the country on strike. I mean, this is what decline looks like, isn't it?
Well, I think the Bank of England had to raise interest rates. I think it was actually slow to do so, and that our figures would probably be improving sooner if the Bank of England had acted faster, as the Federal Reserve did in the United States. That would have paved the way for an earlier recovery. I accept your point on taxation. I think the state has got too big in the United Kingdom. We are spending too much, and because we are spending too much, we are taxing too much. I am concerned also about public services. I've been making the case for at least the last year for people to get back to work, because we've seen a 7.5% decline in productivity in public services, and that coincides with people working from home. And I think we need people back in the office, doing their jobs, delivering public services. I think that's really important.
Let's talk about Brexit then. It's the 3rd anniversary today. How's it going so far?
Oh, I think Brexit's going extremely well. We've got control of our country back. Our democracy now determines how we're governed. And we've saved the small matter of £191 billion by not being part of the EU's plans to recover from COVID, which 2 trillion euros, and our share would have been about £191 billion.
So you said all along, and your friends who wanted this to happen, that red tape would disappear. There would be a festival of deregulation. So what's gone wrong there?
There are nearly 8,000 regulations that have come into the EU since we left that we haven't had to adopt. That's 8,000 fewer regulations.
If you're trying to sell stuff to the EU or buy stuff, you are tied up in red tape as a business, and you know full well yourself this is causing a nightmare for people and causing some of them to stop doing business altogether.
Well, yes, you're absolutely right. I cannot deny, I wouldn't try to deny, that in terms of export to the EU, there has been an increase in red tape. That is a decision for the EU. But we are able to open up trade deals with other countries, which we've been doing, which reduces red tape globally. So it's looking at it as rebalancing the UK as a global economy rather than a narrow European economy. But you're quite right. Europe doesn't want to trade. It's a protectionist, not a free trade area. That's one of the reasons we needed to leave, because that was holding back our economic growth. And more free trade will be good for us, but it opens up our opportunities to the rest of the world.
Jacob Rees-Mogg, thanks very much.
My pleasure. Thank you.